Welcome to Illinois Issues Profiles. I am Mike Lennon, publisher of Illinois Issues magazine. Our guest today is Illinois State Comptroller Roland Burris. The office of Comptroller, created in 1970, is defined by the Illinois State Constitution, Article 5, Section 17, quote, "The Comptroller, in accordance with law, shall maintain the state's central fiscal accounts and order payments into and out of the funds held by the Treasurer," end quote. The Comptroller is placed in a watchdog role to assure that all state payments meet the requirements of law. As the state's chief fiscal officer, his duties reach all levels of the state's financial affairs. He monitors revenue collections and expenditures to and from the state treasury, directs the state government's central accounting system, reports regularly on the financial health of the state, and provides full public access to all state financial records. Elected every 4 years, the Comptroller is the fifth highest-ranking official in state government. Roland Burris, the current Comptroller, was first elected Comptroller in 1978, becoming the first black ever elected to a major state office in Illinois. He was re-elected in 1982 with the third highest vote total in Illinois election history. Burris was born August 3, 1937 in Centralia, Illinois. His family has deep roots in Illinois, dating back to his great-grandfather, who was a farmer in Pulaski County. Comptroller Burris received his BA degree in political science from Southern Illinois University in Carbondale. As an exchange student at the University of Hamburg, Germany, he did graduate work in international law. By 1963, he had earned his law degree from Howard Law School in Washington, D.C. In 1964, he joined Continental Illinois, the state's largest bank, working his way up to vice president after 8 years. In 1972, he was asked to join Governor Walker's cabinet as Director of General Services for the state of Illinois, a position he held for 4 years. As early as his high school days, Burris's ambition was to be an elected state official. Comptroller Burris's office mails out nearly 15 million checks annually, including over 74,000 state employee payroll checks and over 3 million annual state income tax refunds. Sophisticated computers printing 1,000 lines a minute are used to process these checks. Each day, the Comptroller's mailroom sends out about 30,000 checks. The state of Illinois maintains individual records, support documents, and microfilm records of all checks written by the state. All of these are available for public inspection. There are approximately 1,500 monthly requests for examination of these documents. Named by Ebony magazine as one of the nation's 100 most influential black Americans, Burris is only one of 3 statewide black elected officials in the United States. Burris currently lives in Chicago with his wife Berlene and their 2 children, Rolanda Sue and Roland II. In my interview with Burris, he outlined the functions of the Comptroller's office and how that office has changed over the years. He also discussed the future of the Illinois lottery and the changing Illinois tax base. In the concluding portion of our talk, we discussed Comptroller Burris's political plans for the future. Comptroller Burris, not everyone, indeed probably a distinct minority of Illinois citizens really understand what the state's comptroller does. Can you explain the major functions of your office? I'm sure you've got a thumbnail explanation. And then after you've done that, can you distinguish the functions of your office from those of the state treasurer's office and the auditor general?
Certainly, Mike. The function of the comptroller's office primarily is to be the keeper of the state's funds in terms of accountability. The legislature and the governors make the appropriations, and the comptroller has to supervise the spending through the vouchering process. And through that process, we have to naturally keep the accounting system of the state government. And in addition to the accounting system of state government, we also handle the payroll of state government. We pay some 115,000 payrollers every period, whether it's once a month or bi-monthly. And we keep the official financial status of the state. For example, you'll hear information coming out of the Bureau of the Budget or from the Economic and Fiscal Commission, from the legislature, but the official records, what the balances are in some 500 plus odd funds that we manage, will give you the official report. The two main funds that we report on are the General Revenue Fund and the Road Fund. They are the biggest. The General Revenue Fund in this fiscal 1985 year will total about $9.7 billion in spending. The the Road Fund, of course, will be pretty close to $3 billion. So you're getting your $12 billion or so dollars, then you get your capital and your bonding funds, and then your reappropriations, which will push your spending level of state government up to about $17 billion. That's the primary function. Those are the primary functions. And we have another function that's really not known that much in the Comptroller's office, and we are the auditors for the cemetery care trust funds, where where people put money aside for the care of graves throughout the state for private cemeteries, so that the cemeteries will not just be neglected. And also for burial funds, where people are preparing for their internment, where they give money to a funeral director, and that money has to be entrusted, so it'll be there at the time of need. We also have to audit those funds. And that's big business, Mike. I was really surprised to see the millions of dollars that are in both of those type of funds. So we are really the watchdog. We are the last checkpoint before a check is written to pay the state's bills, to handle the obligations of the state, and thereby to protect the taxpayers' money. So we have a watchdog role, and thereby really the spending role for state government.
Well, how do you distinguish that now from both the Treasurer and the Auditor General?
If you take a thumbnail definition between the Treasurer and the Comptroller, the Treasurer is really the state's banker. He actually has custody of the cash. And secondly, the Treasurer is responsible for investing that cash. And the statute says that the Comptroller shall order the payments into and out of the funds that are held by the Treasurer.
I see.
So we will tell the Treasurer to put license plates money into the road fund, and once it gets in the road fund, the Treasurer has to be responsible for investing that money. Then we will then draw out the money out of the road fund when we're paying a bill. And then the Treasurer, of course, will debit his books or deduct it from his books. The Auditor General is really the post-auditor. He sees everything after it's done. And he goes in to verify things under two circumstances. One is according to statute, to make sure that what we call the compliance audit, that all the various agencies are compliant to law. And the other one, of course, is the financial audit, to make sure that the records that we say that we're spending are in fact being spent, and they're looking for any kind of shenanigans that may be caught through the audit. So the Auditor General audit every phase of government, including the Comptroller's Office, the Governor's Office, and various other agencies.
Everything but those two Supreme Court agencies that he can't quite get to look at their books.
Yeah, that's correct.
Do you have a position on that?
I'm a lawyer, by the way, and my dues go into the Administrative and Disciplinary Commission, and I think that it's part of a state agency, and I've supported Auditor Cronson in that position, and to the extent that I have let the Comptroller's weight to that, I have supported him. And I pay my dues into that, and I think it's a part of a state agency. It's created by a state agency, and therefore it should be audited, and I think that Auditor Cronson is winning that case in the federal court.
All right, let me talk a little bit more about these three offices. I know from reading background material on your office and also the Auditor General that when a voucher is made up, a copy goes to your office for payment of state funds. Is that right? For example, the university system, we buy something. If it's over a certain amount of money, we have to file that voucher with you. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And we also have to file it with the Auditor General.
Well, that's for the checkpoint, because that's what we call the C-13 form, and those are actually issued by the Comptroller's Office. We supply those to the various agencies. I think it comes in 6 or 7 copies, right, if I'm not mistaken, and the pink copy goes here, and the yellow copy goes there, and the blue copy goes to the various directions, and that's what we have to do, Mike, in state government, so that we can have a checkpoint on what is happening with the taxpayers' funds.
But the key difference between you and the auditor is that you are authorizing the payment and actually writing the check for a state bill, and then later on the auditor will go in to make sure that you did your job properly and that the people who were signing the vouchers in the various state agencies were purchasing these items or services according to state laws and regulations.
That's correct. And another way of looking at it is we are the pre-auditor and they're the post-auditor. We try to audit things before the check is written to make sure that it is proper. But the only thing we have is the document, the C-13 form, the four corners of that document. I have asked for authority to even have field audit authority, to even go out on site to verify certain things with an investigative force, because sometimes we cannot tell, looking at the four corners of the document, whether or not the goods or services have been presented, whether or not the company in fact exists. Just recently, there was an indictment handed down by individuals who created a dummy company, and they put through the vouchers and checks were written. And through the alertness of a currency exchange employee is how that situation came up. If we had the pre-audit authority, we could make on-site inspections to make sure that the XYZ consulting service to the Department of Public Aid actually exists.
Let me ask you a little bit about how you personally run your office and spend your time. You have offices in both Springfield and Chicago. You commute. How do you divide your time between Springfield and Chicago? And what personally, you can't give attention to every one of those forms that is filed or to the expenditure of all those 17 billions of dollars. What do you choose to spend your time on? Where do you direct your attention?
Well, the best mark of a good administrator is to be able to select adequate and competent staff. And I have been able to put together a very good staff in Springfield. And we are structured where there's a deputy comptroller who oversees the operations, and there are 8 cabinet-level individuals who report to him, who are called directors of our 8 departments. And they all report to the deputy comptroller, and you do it by line management. And they have managers and supervisors that actually run the operation. Our business is timely payment of vouchers and accurate payment of vouchers and processing payrolls and verification of information. That's what we have to do. My responsibilities specifically is I have to oversee policies. There are daily questions will come up. Just got confronted with one which I can't reveal as I flew in this today. Highly confidential nature of something that's happening with an individual and money. So I have to be informed of those. I have to make decisions on those matters. And then, of course, there are documents that only I can sign because it would require the comptroller's signature. We do have a smaller staff in Chicago, but what really keeps me busy in Chicago is this area that I mentioned to you about the cemetery care funds and the burial funds. That staff is mostly in Chicago, and 30 to 40% of my time is spent on the complications of the managing of these millions of dollars in these various trust funds.
That's amazing that the comptroller of the state of Illinois spends 30 to 40% of his time on that function. I would warrant that probably only one person out of 100 knows that.
Well, that's true, but this is a big business. There's always problems. We have to close up cemeteries. We have funeral directors that are trying to sell pre-need without being licensed. And we have the funeral industry and the cemetery industry that are generally at loggerheads with each other. They don't get along. So if one is doing something, then the other one objects to it, and the comptroller has to spend time. We have trust funds that, for example, in one section of the state, had a Ramada Inn in it. It owned a Ramada Inn, and we had to require that trust fund to divest of that investment because it was not really in the best interest of the trust fund. And the case went all the way up to the Supreme Court.
If you could tell every citizen in the state of Illinois one thing and just one thing about the comptroller's office, what would it be?
It would be that we're trying to protect your tax money, that we are the persons of last resort to spend their money, and they have an individual who's very conscious and concerned about how their money is being spent, and we work very hard to make sure that it is spent according to law and it is accurate.
Can you, having been in this office since January 1979 and now in your second term, undoubtedly you have a great store of knowledge on expenditure patterns and spending patterns and revenue patterns. So can we talk a little bit about revenue sources and expenditure patterns?
Sure.
Let me start with what perhaps is the easier one. Have there been any significant changes in expenditure patterns in Illinois since you've taken office? I mean, have you seen a shift from one kind of service or good being purchased or anything, or is it just about stable in percentage of how the money is actually spent?
Well, the percentage of the expenditures are pretty much even. Grants and awards and grants are really the biggest expenditure area. Operations of government has gone up somewhat because of the constant cost of operating.
But they're all going up. I mean,
yeah,
is anything, I mean, is higher education taking off, or central management services, or DOT, are there any, or even the kind of, we're told all the time that we're entering a service economy. Is the state of Illinois spending more on services than on goods, for example, than it used to?
Well, it's staying pretty much even in the percentages. I mean, because as the demand goes up, you still got to produce more goods, and of course that would require more service, which means what I think is unique is the fact that we have expanded government since I've come in from about $10 billion to $17 billion, and we've not had an appreciable rise in staff to handle that workload. You've
got what, about 400?
Yeah, we had 418 when I came in, and we pared it down to about 399 or something, and then the volume just required us to have to build back up. But the number has fluctuated between 390 and 420 employees in our office. And we've gone from $10 billion to $17 billion operation.
All right, let's talk about revenues. I noticed in one of your recent economic reports, your monthly reports, the statement, this is a quote, "The Illinois State Lottery is currently on a wave of success that makes it the fourth largest source of state revenue after income tax, sales tax, and public utility taxes." My question is, can this continue? We've seen a dip in lottery revenues before. I think from 76 to 80, it went down to down around 60 million.
Even lower than that. It went down to 29 million,
29 million?
In 1979, and net to the state. We get about 44 cents out of each dollar that's spent, and the rest of it goes for prize money and operating costs. And it went down to 29 million. Thompson was getting ready to really scrap the program until they started the instant game. The daily game. And they started the daily game, and revenues began to pick up, where in this year they're estimating revenues to be about $460 million net to the state.
Are we getting too dependent on the lottery?
You have to be very careful. It's a very shaky source of revenue, Mike, and I have expressed caution in this area. All you need is one major scandal. For example, somebody fraudulently winning a prize. If that happens, then you're going to see the persons backing off. I support the lottery. I support it very strongly. I think it's a voluntary tax. It has been a good source of revenue, but it is not a source of revenue on which you want to build programs on because of the fluctuating nature of that business. The $40 million winner has been one of the biggest boosts to the state program. That young man is having trouble picking up his check, by the way. He gets $2 million a year, and we've been trying to get him to come get his check.
Let me ask you about some of the other revenue sources, or rather, let me see if I can fold that into a larger question, as we're running down on our time here. Do you think that we're going to see any major changes in the tax structure of Illinois in the next few years? We have kind of a patchwork tax system, and we haven't had a major reform of the tax structure in Illinois for a long time. Do you think we're going to see any major changes, less dependence on property tax or income tax or service tax? All these things are being thrown around. Or are we going to just limp along in the same way as before?
Well, the governor had his tax reform commission. I thought something would have come out of that, but really it came out with no new ground. I issued a report on the tax structure in Illinois, and that report indicated that Illinois, even though we have a patched system, it is pretty evenly split between income tax, sales tax, and real estate tax. And if one won't get you, the other one will. So I kind of issued a report that we don't want to do too much tampering with that system because it is equally distributed, and it is not that burdensome on business or on individuals. So when you do an analysis of our structure, though, people are really complaining about real estate taxes now, and they're on the decline. We must be concerned that you don't have a situation where you get out of balance, and you'll have people paying income taxes and people over here not paying real estate taxes to offset. There's a movement in the state, Mike, to move strictly to an income tax to try to generate the revenues. I think that that would be a mistake, to move strictly to income taxes. Certainly real estate taxes are very unpopular, but
We still need some.
we're still going to need those revenues.
Having been elected in both 78 and 82, Governor Thompson has been in office during this entire period. How would you characterize, what would you say are the chief differences in fiscal philosophy between the Thompson administration and your own office?
Well, when we came in with the governor, we came in really under some cloud of suspicion because my predecessor had really been kind of discredited by the governor's office, but it turned out when you looked at numbers, that comptroller was correct. But they control the system. The governor's people control the flow of the money. They can slow it up, they can speed it up, they can speed up the vouchers or slow up the vouchers. That is one major difference. So my approach to it is not to really attack the governor head on, but to report on what the governor says. And that's the philosophy that we've taken, and we've proven ourselves to be correct. We turned out, for example, to say that we were heading for a difficult time in 1981 and 82, and there was an election year, and the governor told everybody everything was fine. We said, well, no, that is not the case. If what you said was going to happen is in fact happening, then we're in dire financial straits. And it turned out, of course, we had to raise the taxes. We did run into spending problems. So our philosophy has not been to be combative or confront the governor in any antagonistic way, only when necessary, and not to politicize my office. We cooperated with the governor very closely when the state had to go out and borrow the $200 million for the first time in history. We ran out of money, or would have run out of money, if we had not used that 1898 statute that allowed us to do casual borrowing. We cooperate when it's in the interest of the taxpayers. But we want to be the conscience of the citizens of the state, and we just don't want them to what the governor tells them, because the Bureau of the Budget gives a political side. We give, by law, the responsible side, regardless to how it comes. We have to report the facts and figures.
How are your relations with the Bureau of the Budget? How do you folks get along?
I don't really, well, certainly our people
You
get
have a
along.
lot of interaction?
We interact, and I interact with the governor. I mean, if there's always responsiveness on the part of Jim Thompson, there's no...
He's an easy governor to work with.
Certainly, and I'm an easy comptroller to work with. I mean, when he needs me, we call, we communicate, and we judge. I objected to one thing he wanted to do. He wanted to take down the balance of the loan in that fiscal year, $50 million, just to make the balance be at where he wanted it to be on June 30th. And I looked at that and I said, I don't think the taxpayers should have to pay interest, Governor, on $50 million just for you to have your number where you want it to, and we didn't take it down during that fiscal year. We took the $50 million down during the next fiscal year.
Well, as you can see, we're moving closer and closer to political questions here as we get to the end of our show. Let me ask you a couple. You recently ran and came in second in a field of 4 for the Democratic nomination for U.S. Senator. Can you briefly reflect on that campaign?
Certainly, Mike, I'd be more than happy to. I knew that Senator Percy was vulnerable. I traveled this state in 1982, and people were complaining about Senator Percy. And I certainly then began to pursue my options to run for the United States Senate. And I won in that re-election for comptroller by the 3rd largest margin in the history of the state, which naturally gave us some motivation to try to move up. We could do it without giving up our office. And the first person I went to talk to about my run for the United States Senate was the senator-elect, Paul Simon. And Paul told me he wasn't interested in running, so I began to put together my campaign. And when Paul decided to run, I was too far down the line, and I did not get out. I knew if there was one person who could who could beat me in Illinois, was Paul. And that's what happened in that primary when we ran a very good race on very limited resources. And I have no regrets for having made that campaign. It was an experience. It let the people know that Roland Burris can deal with national, international, and local issues, that I do my homework, and I really seek to serve the people. Because I'm in public office by choice, not by accident.
What kind of a U.S. Senator do you think Paul Simon's going to make?
A terrific U.S. Senator. I mean, he's a lifelong elected official. He's not like Senator Percy, who started out in the United States Senate with his first elective office. He has the legislative experience. He has the the handle on the problems in Illinois, and he has passed more bills in the United States House of Representatives than any representative in the country. He has the legislative skills.
Let's talk about your political future. You are one of a handful of black state officials elected statewide.
There are three of us in the nation.
Three of you in the nation.
The
right?
Treasurer of the state of Connecticut and the Secretary of State of the state of Michigan.
What has this experience been like? I mean, you're in a rather select club here. Do you three get together and compare notes?
We hold our convention in a telephone booth. No, we're good friends, and yes, we do talk because we have a unique problem. That is, we represent 11.5 million people, and it just so happened that we were born black through the grace of the Lord, which we had nothing to do with, but it does add a little extra curiosity there. But we don't serve as black elected officials. I serve as Comptroller of the state of Illinois, and I represent 11.5 million people. When I process those vouchers, I'm just as concerned about John Doe's tax payment as I am about Jim Rowe's tax payment, tax dollars being spent. So I govern based on ability and not...
Still, you must have some reflections. Do you think we're going to see more black elected officials in positions like yours?
Oh, absolutely. We are encouraging that. I mean, I travel across the country. I will be, in the next year, I will be the president of the National Association of State Comptrollers, Auditors, and Treasurers. I mean, I will head all of those members nationally next year. We're going to the convention, and I will become first vice president, and the following year I will become president. And I travel the nation saying that we have to have more officials who happen to be born black running for statewide office. And of course, we try to get them. They have to put together the ingredients to be able to be elected. And Mike, I have no regrets. I've had great experience by being born and raised in Southern Illinois, in Centralia. I have deep roots in this state.
Four generations?
Four generations. I'm a fourth generation. My son's a fifth generation. And I have grandnieces and nephews who are sixth generation Burrises in Illinois. And this is my piece of real estate. I love it. At 16 years old, I set two goals for myself. One was to be a lawyer, and the other goal was to be a statewide elected official of Illinois. I'm doing exactly what I wanted to do at 16 years old, and I want to move up.
Well, that's my final question here as we're getting down to our last minute. What are your political plans for the future? Would you be running for another statewide office?
We certainly will. That has not been determined yet. The election's over, and we're now in the process of assessing right now which office we will be seeking to run for. I do want to move up higher in the state pecking order, and we're looking at four offices above me, and we're looking at least three of them.
And you're a lawyer, so Attorney General would be no
I'm a lawyer. There's a Democratic Attorney General. He may have ambitions, and we too will have ambitions.
Well, I'd like to thank you for joining us, Comptroller Burris. In the analysis portion of this program, where members of the press will discuss my conversation with Comptroller Roland Burris, will follow immediately. Thank you, Comptroller Burris.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Joining us for an analysis of my conversation with Comptroller Burris are, on my immediate left, Diane Ross, who is legislative correspondent and State House Bureau Chief for Illinois Issues magazine, and on her left, Charles Wheeler, who is State House correspondent for Chicago Sun-Times. Diane, Charlie, I'd like to begin the discussion talking a little bit more about the distinction between the Comptroller's office, the Treasurer's office, and the Auditor General's office. And I thought I had it pretty well worked out, but again, in looking at my conversation with Comptroller Burris, I still have a little confusion. Maybe you can help me. When I get my paycheck from the state of Illinois, the person who signs that paycheck, I believe, is Treasurer Donowald. His name is certainly embossed on the check.
Roland's name is on the check also.
And Comptroller Burris. So who draws the check or signs the check? Is it the state treasurer, or is it the state comptroller, or is it a joint function?
I think with both names on the check, it's joint.
Must be a joint
I'm
function.
pretty sure the comptroller actually cuts the checks. In other words, someone in his office or a machine in his office will actually print the check, probably from a computer tape submitted, in your case, by the university, saying, here's our payroll.
It is issued by his office.
It is, all right. Well, then the function of the state treasurer then apart from investing the funds, which is a very important function of the State Treasurer's Office, really seems to be just to be sort of a reservoir of all these funds. They don't cut the checks. They don't determine what funds the state monies go in. What does the Treasurer do? A Treasurer doesn't really act like a banker, except in issuing checks.
But he does in the sense that a banker, for example, if you have a checking account with your local bank, you write the checks. The local bank doesn't write the checks. But the bank handles the money, accepts the check for payment, disburses the funds. If you have savings, the bank turns around and invests your savings, and that's what the Treasurer does. He is a banker in that sense. He is the holder, the custodian of the money. He has, as much as anyone, he has physical possession of the state's monies.
But he can't do anything with them except invest them.
He can invest them. He can spend them only to the extent that the comptroller tells him to. It's the comptroller's responsibility to accept the voucher from the agency, and as the comptroller indicated, he does not do any great investigation as to whether or not this is a legitimate expenditure of state money. His role is limited pretty much to making sure that the form is followed, that the voucher is properly filled out, and that the account against which the voucher is drawn has sufficient funds in it to cover this expense. And if that's the case, he'll cut the check. It goes to whoever the recipient is, and then when the money's cashed, the treasurer makes the adjustments in the funds that he holds.
I consider Burris the bookkeeper, and Donewald then is the banker, and then Cronson comes along afterwards and goes over Burris's books.
All right, well, let me ask a naive question. Why do we need, I'm sure we do, because the state constitution, 1970 state constitution set these offices up, why do we need both a treasurer and a comptroller? Why can't the treasurer keep the books, or why can't the comptroller invest the money? What's the necessity of the division of responsibility? What purpose does that serve in safeguarding funds?
I think the purpose is that so the same person who writes the check is not also the one who holds the money. Whether or not, I think it's arguable whether or not you have to have someone elected to serve the role of treasurer. But the history at the Constitutional Convention was that there was very little sentiment on the part of the delegates to do away with any elected offices. The only one that was recommended that it be made a point of was the former office of Superintendent of Public Instruction. Arguably, there's no good case from a policy point of view that can be made, for example, for electing a Secretary of State. Nonetheless, when the delegates sat down to consider the executive branch, the then Secretary of State walked in, appeared before their committee meeting. He was Paul Powell, and he said something to the effect, "You're not thinking about doing away with this office, are you?" And Alex said, "Oh, no, Mr. Powell, no, your office, that's fine," because he was a powerful political figure, and there was a concern that should the new Constitution recommend the office of Secretary of State be made appointive, Secretary Powell would turn around and work against the new Constitution. His opposition could have been sufficient to sink the document.
So you're saying there's a political element to the number of state offices.
Often those offices are considered, as Roland indicated, stepping stones to something else. It's like the minor leagues for guys who want to be governor or U.S. senator.
But there is some logic behind it. If you consider Burris, for example, the bookkeeper, and as Charlie was talking about earlier, is when those vouchers come in, look at that particular bookkeeping fund to make sure there is enough money to support the check or the body of the vouchers, whatever. He's concerned with that fund going down. Donewald, on the other example, as the banker, as the investor, is looking at what's available and how long that will be available so he can place his investments at various banks. One thing I think we should mention that we haven't is there is a lot of room, and I certainly think Donewald is carrying on with what Cosentino did and his predecessor in developing I don't want to call them social programs, but for example, there are mortgage programs. There are farm mortgage programs and housing mortgage programs, various other things that fail to come to mind, that he has adopted as a way to continue to invest the state's money, but as something you can do for certain segments of the economy that might need a little help. So it's not just deciding which banks is going to put the money in and how long it's going to sit there. There's room, there's a little latitude for other things, and that's certainly going on at the same time.
do you know offhand, either of you, what kind of income we're talking about on investment of state funds over a year period? Is it significant?
Oh, yes, it's in the neighborhood of, what, 150 now?
It depends, I think, on what the
Fluctuates a
current
little bit.
markets are. There have been times when it's been as high as several $100 million, and there's been other times when it's been $100 million or less, depending on two things: how much money is available and what the going market rates are.
So it's
In
up
the
there
late
with the lottery as an income source.
Oh yeah, yeah, it's considerable, particularly in the late 70s when interest rates were high, when we had sizable available balances. We were raking in a lot of interest or investment income. Conversely, in
That
the
was
depths
part
of
of
the
the windfall
recession,
for government.
we were not doing as well on the investment income because we didn't have the money sitting around to invest. We were sort of hand to mouth, if you will, just bringing in enough to make each
Covering cash
each pay
flow.
period.
Okay, we've talked about the distinctions and relations to a certain extent between comptroller, treasurer, audit general, and the post-audit function. Can we switch the discussion now and talk about the relationship, let's say the differing perspectives of the comptroller and the director of the Bureau of the Budget? On an earlier program which you were on, you heard Dr. Mandeville of the Bureau of the Budget had some critical words for Comptroller Burris. Comptroller Burris, while he didn't have much to say by way of criticism, clearly has a differing perspective than Dr. Mandeville. What's the nature of their relationship, and what's the nature of the friction between them?
Well, to me, it comes down to one basic thing that they have always had the friction on. And in my opinion, that's where the arguments they both have the greatest credibility, and that's what we were just talking about, was cash flow. To me, that's the only area they can really get into it. And Burris had just mentioned here the manipulation of funds that the governor and i.e. Mandeville, through their control of the executive branch, can control the cash flow by telling the agency directors, don't send in your vouchers for this, that, and the other now.
Slow down spending.
Right, slow down spending so the balance can build up, or vice versa, send those vouchers in. And of course, Burris is bound by certain time restrictions to process things, so he's really caught in the middle of that. But that struck me when he was also talking about the fiscal problems the state had during the recession. The various measures that the governor proposed and the legislature did in fact go along with. He brought up one of them. The first one was what was widely discussed as the legalization of the manipulation of cash flow. There was actually legislation that allowed the governor to skim the tops off funds that had a little extra money that we didn't have to pay bills out of and move that around, interfund transfers, if you will. Comptrollers have been criticizing governors for doing that for some time. Everyone knew that they did it. There was nothing you could really prove here or there how it was being done. But the legislature certainly went along with that.
This is almost a structural.
It was a short-term measure, right.
But I mean, this debate or differences of opinion, and this is almost endemic to the system, the way the system works. The governor's need for whatever purpose to move funds around and manipulate them to a certain extent, and the comptroller is looking more for clarity and system order and so forth.
Well, but I think it's really all political. It's done for political reason, and it's pointed out for political reasons. The other, before I forget, the other thing I wanted to mention, the other thing in the fiscal problems during the recession, besides the manipulation of the cash flow, was what Burris was talking about with state borrowing. And there was at one time a proposal by Thompson to borrow $150 million so we could cover cash flow. Oh, I'm sorry, it was greater than that. It was $200 million, if I remember correctly. And the comptroller decided that he didn't think it was right to pay interest on all that. We really only needed, he thought, $150 million. So he balked at that. Why I'm thinking of this, or those are the only two times during the entire fiscal crisis that I can remember that the comptroller really asserted himself.
Mm-hmm. Well, what about, Charlie, what about Dr. Mandeville's criticism of Comptroller Burris for not pitching in to help on the tax increase in 1983?
I think that it was justified to a certain extent because Burris was not one of those out front early, as was the governor. Part of Mandeville's problem with Burris is that he sees Burris as acting, notwithstanding the comptroller's denial, as acting in a political manner. And he has said in the past that some of the things that Burris will say are prejudicial to the best interests of the state, in the sense that Burris will be warning about there will be cash flow problems and that we could run out of funds or have trouble paying our bills at a time when Mandeville, in the Bureau of the Budget, believes that because of the game plan that he's developed in conjunction with the governor, because of his ability to defer some payments and to request, for example, federal reimbursement money earlier than normal, Mandeville believes that we'll be able to avert these kind of problems. And Burris comments Mandeville sees as hurting Illinois' image of fiscal management, particularly, I guess, the Thompson administration's image as a good fiscal manager with the bond markets out in New York.
Well, for example, we're talking about the $200 million being borrowed. Thompson had a specific reason for asking for $200 million because he wanted the cash flow and the available balance to be at a certain point. So, in fact, the bonding houses and so on would not mark us down. I mean, things were getting a little tense at that point.
We did drop a notch in the bond ratings for a period of time there, didn't we?
Yeah, it was because...
Just one.
Well, the political differences, as you characterize them, between the governor's administration, Dr. Mandeville, and Comptroller Burris, those notwithstanding, what kind of a job has Comptroller Burris done? Haven't there been some innovations in the sorts of reports? You mentioned one earlier.
I think that one of the things that the comptroller should be credited for is that he's gone beyond the mere bookkeeping function, and he's tried to provide some historical analysis in spending patterns and in state programs. His monthly reports contain not only a listing of how the funds balances have changed during the preceding month, they also contain a section looking at the overall economic health of the state, in which efforts are made to take a future look at what the economy could hold for Illinois, although he does not do the specific type of revenue estimating, say, that the Bureau of the Budget does or the Economic and Fiscal Commission. He will look at what is the economic picture, and he may target one particular area of enterprise. This is what it looks like for auto sales, or this is what the manufacturing sector might hold in the coming months. And he also does a historical analysis of some particular program. Here's how spending for prisons has increased over the last 10 years. Here's how road fund monies have been used over the last 10 years. Which
Here's an
types
update on
of
bonded
analyses
indebtedness.
are very useful for one who wants to see trends in how state money has been spent, see what direction state government is going. If you look at it over such a long historical period, you can see patterns of for example, how we're getting away from institutionalized care of the mentally ill and developmentally disabled, going more towards community-based care. And I find those very useful.
I've
and this
seen
is
one of-
an innovation for which Comptroller Burris can take credit.
And they are
his-
continuing to evolve, too.
This was nothing, his predecessor was Lindbergh.
No, it was Mike
Mike
Bacalus.
Bacalus, and Lindbergh was...
Lindbergh was the first comptroller.
Was the first comptroller, and this was not done under Lindbergh.
No.
Or Bacalus?
Lindbergh came in a situation where it was a brand new office. He had to establish its credibility. Under Lindbergh, the comptroller's office became a source of fiscal and financial information that presented an opposite view, if you will, to the then governor, who was Dan Walker. And the irony of it is the person who made the comptroller's office for Lindbergh was Dr. Mandeville, who was the deputy comptroller and who in many respects established the degree of credibility and the degree of reliability that people now have in the comptroller.
What about Bacalus? Do you remember much about what...
I was not here then.
Did he to change the functions of the office?
He was a little bit more aggressive with the office than Lindbergh was. He wanted to go out and do more of the program analyses than Lindbergh. Lindbergh had sort of a strict construction of what the office should be. Bacalus saw it as an independent constitutional office which could present a different view to the governor in terms of not just the fiscal matters, but in programs in general, what the state should be doing. Part of that maybe stems from the difference in the men. George Lindbergh was not, at least my feeling about him at the time was he was not a man driven by ambition for higher office. Mike Bacalus was a man who saw himself rising and wanted to be governor.
I found that somewhat interesting that, well, as you say, Mike McAllis went on to run for governor, and Comptroller Burris talks about moving up the ladder, and his office has been described, and I don't know who describes it this way, as the 5th highest ranking office in state government. Who decides whether it's 4th or 5th or 3rd? Is it just by seniority, like in the federal
No,
government?
I assume that part of it is by law, yeah, by succession to the governor.
Succession to the governorship.
Yeah, the Constitution spells out...
So it is the same as in the federal government, which is that's how it's based there, in succession to the governor as well.
Well, he's speaking of the governor, lieutenant governor, secretary of state, and attorney general, and comptroller would be 5th, followed by treasurer in the cellar.
He clearly does have political ambitions and wants to move up. His campaign for the Democratic nomination for the United States Senate seat was fairly successful. Rather, he didn't win, but he came in second, and
well,
he did defeat a couple of fairly formidable people.
I think that the one element in his campaign which I'm sure disappointed him was the fact that he did not do as well downstate as he had hoped to with his roots in Centralia. The reason he came in second was frankly because he did so well in the black areas of Chicago, which I suppose is to be expected. I know that he hoped to run better downstate and in the white areas than he did.
Didn't he come in? But he did come in second after Simon downstate, didn't he?
But Simon got 60% of the vote outside of the Cook County area, so it wasn't a strong showing.
Second by a wide majority.
Second by a wide majority. What do you think would be the given those results, second but disappointing in some ways, but given the large numbers of black voters that have been registered in Chicago, given the political climate in the state, what kind of a political future do you foresee for Comptroller Roland Burris?
I think that, well, what are the elements that are going to figure into what he does? I think Roland has to decide what he wants to go for. He'd like to be Attorney General if indeed Neil Hartigan runs for governor and vacates that office. I'm sure he'd like to be Lieutenant Governor. Part of it is you have to wait and see what's available. You have to wait and see what sort of a shaking out process there is. His credentials among the regular Democratic organization members in the city of Chicago are not all the best because when he was not slated for U.S. Senator, he stayed in the race nonetheless. Party types, loyal party types, would argue that if you're not slated, you should get out. Rock was slated, Burris stayed in, Simon stayed in, Seith stayed in. People have criticized Roland Burris for his vote for Jesse Jackson for president at the Democratic National Convention. He was at the convention as one supposedly or expected to be committed to Walter Mondale. When push came to shove, he voted for Reverend Jackson, and he said that this was to have been expected of someone in his position, and probably so. But these are the kind of things that
Because the slate-making thing, slate-making does not play the role that it used to play. Paul Simon wasn't slated either, but he won.
Yeah.
And slate-making didn't do Senate President Rock a great deal of good. He came in 4th in a field of 4. So these kinds of things could be forgotten, couldn't they? I mean, the slate-making thing.
Yeah, but it helps in the city of Chicago if you have that backing.
Well, I heard you mention Lieutenant Governor. Could you conceive of a Hartigan-Burris ticket for the next gubernatorial?
I would guess not, because I don't think that Roland Burris would be particularly interested in being the second banana.
You think Attorney General
Attorney
is the more
General would
likely?
be a much more attractive position for him.
Well,
although we're just off one election, and it's
too early to tell.
As
he just described it himself. He wants to move up, and I mean, he talked about Attorney General, but
I mean, there's other people out there with ambition too, not the least of
we've got a
whom is
minute.
the
How about
Speaker of the
sketching
House.
out some of those? How about sketching out some of those scenarios for who is going to be running for what? Who, for example, might we see running for a Republican for Attorney General?
I'm not sure, to be honest.
Is there anybody, any likely names? Or who is the great mentioner mentioned out there? Is anybody mentioning any names?
For Attorney General?
Most of the names that
Republican
you
for
see
Attorney
mentioned now are
Democrats.
yeah, and they're mentioned by the people themselves who are trying to get themselves in the position of
More
being
talked
one
about.
mentioned. Yeah. I have to confess that I'm not sure who on the Republican side is, at this point, is
Is going
interested
for
in being
what?
Attorney General.
Somebody mentioned to me the other day, again, the great mentioner, Senator Custra, state senator from Glenview, as a possibility for an office like a comptroller should Roland Burris run for. These political candidates must have to have a big wall chart and list all
Well,
the possible options. If so-and-so does this, then I do that. I mean, is that the way it works?
Almost everything
pretty much
depends,
how
I
it
think,
is.
on whether Thompson decides to run for a fourth term, because if he does not, then, for example, Edgar could possibly move up. I don't know what George Ryan would be planning to do at that point. But once you get the top of the ticket freed, for example, then everyone can start jockeying for position. But it becomes much more complicated. If Thompson's going to run again, then you assume Edgar would run again, and it's much more restricted.
It's like George Ryan said not too long ago, that all these folks are kind of in the same position at this time. They're all trying to keep their options open, wait and see what happens.
Well, on the Illinois Issues Profile, in the last month or so, I've talked to Senate President Rock. He has told me that he is definitely going to run for a statewide office. We've seen Comptroller Burris indicate that he is going to run for another statewide office.
Another being the key word.
Another being the key word. And when I spoke to Attorney General Hartigan on one of the first programs in the series, he indicated that he was very likely to be running for governor. So
And you have House Speaker Michael Madigan from Chicago, who, although has not said that he is going to run for statewide office, there's a suspicion among many people that this is among the options he's weighing.
Yes, you've written you wrote one piece on that. How is that shaping up? How is what's your feeling now on the Hartigan-Madigan situation on who's likely to emerge as the Democratic front runner?
I think that were it today, it would still be Hartigan. But it's too early to tell whether or not Madigan's even going to actually make the try for it.
Well, there was a lot of talk after the primaries about the incredible advantage it is to have already been a statewide candidate, as Hartigan has been, and to have won on a couple of occasions, and also to be a statewide office holder. For example, slating did not do Phil Rock any good. Now, in some aspects, Mike Madigan is in the same position that Phil Rock was in. He has never run for a statewide office. He has run for a room-wide office as Speaker, but I mean, his constituency has always been entirely within the legislative branch.
Well, you know, I've often questioned that a little bit. Comptroller Burris always mentions that he is the third largest vote getter in state history. Alan Dixon has been saying that he is the largest vote getter. That's repeated over and over again. You have to ask, who indeed have they defeated in these elections? Mike Bacalus won 2 statewide elections too, if I remember, for Superintendent of Public Instruction and for Comptroller. It certainly didn't do him any good in his next outing. And I
Or
wonder,
Michael Howlett, who was a
Michael
very popular.
Howlett,
Excellent
one of
example.
the great vote getters, the man who is reputed to have known more people by name in Illinois than anybody in the history of the state.
Well,
and
they
so
like to talk about million vote margins, that select club of people that can claim million vote margins.
Well, Dixon is the only one that has carried every state, every county, I believe.
I don't know that offhand.
I think Dixon is maybe the only one.
It could well
Not
be.
sure about that, but we'll have to get our researchers checking on that information. But I believe Dixon is one of the, well,
I'd be interested in testing by the time we get to the next primaries. This whole experiment we had this year, and whether, for example, Phil Rock with no statewide campaigning experience against someone, say, of Hartigan's caliber, certainly has and is known for a good personality on the campaign trail. How that affects people like Mike Madigan, who certainly cannot make that claim yet. And although I see him weighing this, he has to give natural reluctance to that kind of an edge Hartigan would have.
well, we seem to have an awful lot of Democrats that, including Comptroller Burris, who may be lining up. But on the Republican side, really all we have, who do we have beside Lieutenant Governor Ryan, and we have Secretary of State Edgar. Do we have any other?
Well, the minority leader in the House, Lee Daniels, in
Daniels,
the
of
past has
course.
been interested in Attorney
Right.
General. He may well decide to throw his hat in the ring again this time. And
What about Pate Phillip? What is your
As-
sense of his perhaps statewide ambitions at this point?
I think Pate would like to be Secretary of State. Part of it is that when you come off one election, it's a little too early yet to see these things develop. You'll see more of this occur next spring as we get into the legislative session.
So
You'll see
Comptroller
people-
Burris is, at this point, as you saw in the program, was not ready to make any sort of formal announcement, but wanted to let it be known that indeed he was seriously considering moving up, as he said, and Attorney General was one strong possibility.
Yes.
Right. Okay, well, thank you very much. Diane Ross of Illinois Issues Magazine and Charlie Wheeler from the Chicago Sun-Times for joining us on this edition of Illinois Issues Profiles. Thank you and good evening.
This has been Illinois Issues Profiles. For assistance in producing this program, we wish to thank the panel and the Illinois Information Service. Illinois Issues Profiles is produced by Sangamon State University and Illinois Issues, a monthly magazine of public affairs, co-sponsored by Sangamon State and the University of Illinois. For subscription information, write to Illinois Issues, Sangamon State University, Springfield, 62708, or call area code 217-786-6084.